welcome back to my class. Today's topic is chapter 22. Now this is going to be the time period that covers the United States after the end of World War I through the Roaring 20s. Okay, some things go on that kind of define America's new approach to world events. Like, we are not going to do that anymore. It's called isolationism. We've already been here before. We got away from it a short period of time and fought and won the war, but now it's time to return back to us. And so that is going to be the way that America is moving forward, to focus on our own issues and to tune out the problems of Europe and the rest of the world. Because if we hear those problems, we might have to care. And if we have to care, then we might have to help. So let's not even listen to it. 1920s brings us a new president. Warren G. Harding is elected against the Democratic candidates because Warren G. Harding comes in and says, I want to return us to normalcy. Yeah, a lot of Americans are down with that. We want to get back to normal. We want to quit fretting about other countries' problems and simply focus on ourselves. And so with that promise of return to normalcy, he had us hook, line, and sinker. So Americans embrace the new president, the Republican who's coming in 1920. His name is Warren G. Harding. And Warren G. Harding is going to bring with him a group of his friends from back home. He calls them the Ohio Gang. And the Ohio Gang is his card-playing buddies from the weekends, and he thinks they need cool jobs. So he hires them as his heads of his cabinet and some high-level positions of importance, even though they weren't qualified. Qualifications, who cares? These are my friends, and I can trust them. That was his belief anyway. Well, one of the individuals that he hires, his name is Albert Fall. Albert Fall is going to be given the job of the Secretary of the Interior. This is the man who will actually go to prison for a year and kind of be the poster boy for whatever is wrong with the Harding administration, which seemed to be a lot. Albert Fall took some backroom deals with some oil companies, and he divvied out some oil leases on government land, which you're not supposed to do. But he thought, hey, it's way back in the woods. Nobody's going to know. It's just, our secret. Well, unfortunately, it became known and it was exposed. And so when Harding is approached about, what are you doing? Why would you let this man get away with this? Well, his answer was, these are my friends. I trust them. I'm not a micromanager. Well, ultimately, the pressure is too strong, and Harding is going to have a stroke and die, elevating his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, to the presidency. And Coolidge will be another Republican, of course, but Coolidge is going to really kind of shine that image up of the presidency once again. He's a good guy, apparently. He is very honest. His handle or nickname was Silent Cal. Silent Cal really was not a guy who was out and about. Wasn't a lot of noisemaker. Silent Cal's best line was, the business of America is business. And so he used that concept to base every decision that he made as president, whether it was about foreign policy, whether it was about the business community, or whether it was about the needs of his citizens. Everything had to do with how is it going to benefit business. So he formed and he shaped his entire presidency based on that. He does one thing though. He keeps Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of Treasury. Now Andrew Mellon was chosen by Harding, and Andrew Mellon was the bright spot in the Harding administration. Andrew Mellon actually reduced government spending so much that he created this thing we call a balanced budget. Money in, money out. It's a push. It's the same. And that's what every presidential administration hopes for. Ultimately, we know that it's kind of a not achievable goal by most of those guys, but Harding did this because he had this really smart money guy in Mellon. Well, Coolidge keeps Mellon, which, good idea. Kind of kept it, he kept the financial aspects kind of static. We're not going up, we're not going down. But what is going on around all this is the business community is exploding. You know, when World War I ended and we had all of these hundreds of thousands of young men who came from the war needing a job, well, the labor market just kind of was flooded. And so companies looked around, saw all these able people with hands and said, you know what, I think I can use that. And they diversified the business community. All these companies started making new and exciting inventions that we had never seen before. We call them labor-saving devices. They built washing machines. They created irons. They created electric radios. They created electric sweepers. There's just a whole lot of stuff. Refrigerators, well, called ice boxes at the time. A lot of the stuff that the American housewife could use and could make her life much easier. And so we saw a proliferation of these gadgets by these new companies that are starting to generate. And there's a whole lot of excitement about these companies, and then there's a whole lot of investments being poured in. This is what's going to cause us an issue shortly down the road because of these investments and this money being poured into the business community is going to allow, or should I say, pave the way for these companies to start artificially inflating the value of their companies. They're doing this in conjunction with, from help from, presidential administration. Harding was a business guy. Coolidge continues that approach. And so they have this thing called laissez-faire, is the way they shape their economic policy. It is a French phrase. It means to let business alone. They take all the brakes and the rules off business and let it business roll. And if you're a business owner in that period, you do whatever you need to do to make a dollar. We, as the government, we're not gonna monitor you. No, we're not gonna change your rules. You just play on your own field. So businesses took that idea and they said, okay, we can do what we want to do then. And they did, without regard to the environment, without regard to the dangers presented to the employees, without thinking about anything except the bottom dollar and the profit margin. So this is what's going to actually be the very basic early bloom of the Roaring 20s. A lot of this money that is made is generated falsely because companies are hyperinflating the value of their stock and selling it to individuals and other people who think they can make a fast dollar. And you know what? They do, but unfortunately, it's built on a house of cards and it will come tumbling down. So Harding, dies. Coolidge takes over. And then when Coolidge takes over, he brings us, of course, into a new understanding of the presidency. We're going to see Coolidge has a relatively uneventful presidency. He is going to be in office when some things go on in the country. We have this thing called the Scopes Monkey Trial. Anytime you have a nation that is divided between conservatives and liberals, you have two opinions. Now, we clearly know that is a real thing because it's a very strong, real thing today, in the fact that the conservatives are very rigid and very don't change things. And then we have the liberals saying, hey, change is not bad. Why not mix it up sometimes? So you do have some extremism on both sides. And this is nothing new to the United States, because when the Scopes Monkey Trial happened in 1925, it was all based on this concept of fighting against the whole notion of the survival of the fittest, which, was a Darwin thing that said only the strong survive. And that he also coined with that the theory of evolution, that you and I walking today are the products of an evolutionary chain that started with the split from the ape kingdom, that we actually evolved from peoples, early prehistoric peoples, who were pretty closely related to the monkeys. So we had this big case, the Scopes monkey trial. Ultimately, John Scopes was a science teacher who was approached to highlight how awful this law that had been passed. It said that you were not allowed to teach evolution as a science teacher in schools. You had to teach creationism, which, that story, God created the heaven and earth in 7 days, and on the seventh day he rested. That's creationism. That, the story of Adam and Eve and all of those things that the Bible teaches, that we learn in Sunday school if you're a Christian. Well, he is approached. Would you be willing to teach evolution? Chances are you're going to go to jail, but it'll help us to prove that creationism is not a totally, fully on accepted idea. So Scopes agreed. Ultimately, in his science class, he teaches about evolution, and he will get arrested. He will be tried, and because it is in Dayton, Tennessee, very conservative state, he is found guilty of violating that law. Fined $100 and said, go on about your life. But it kind of brings some attention that, both conservatives and liberals didn't want. This was a show trial. It was a very kind of wild atmosphere the whole time it was going on. And it made both sides kind of look a little bit like, well, you guys aren't right, but we're not right either. And so pointed out that we as Americans, we have the right to make our own decision about which school of thought we want to follow. And then 1927, Charles Lindbergh makes his famous flight across the Atlantic Ocean. He goes from New York City to Paris, France, in the plane that is called the Spirit of St. Louis. He makes this thing this is nonstop, 33 and a half hours. Now, he just fills the plane full of fuel so he can fuel it up in flight, because if you go down, you're over the ocean, you're done. So he fills the plane with fuel and a bag of sandwiches, and off he goes, because he's taken a challenge that had been issued by a major newspaper that said the first person to make a transatlantic flight wins $25,000. So this guy says, that's me, and he does it. He will actually do this in 33 and a half hours, lands in Paris, becomes an instant celebrity. He does get the $25,000, but unfortunately, that's going to bring to him one of the greatest sadnesses that a parent can ever have to deal with. His 2-year-old child, baby Lindbergh, will be kidnapped and murdered in a fake ransom that this $25,000 kind of put him out there, and people saw that, and this person used that as the reason to do evil. The authorities pick up Bruno Hauptmann, who was a German man who worked for the Lindberghs. He was their handyman, and the baby is going to be found buried less than a mile from the house, and it was theorized that the baby had been killed immediately after they took it from the house. But Mr. Hauptmann's ladder because he'd been working there for them. Mr. Houtman's ladder was stood up on the side of the house underneath the baby's open window when the police arrived the next day. So he's first person of interest, and he would be found guilty and executed for the kidnap and murder of the Lindbergh baby. Ultimately, do we know he did it? No. And you can't go back and disprove or prove. But this is one of those things that fame and celebrity is a double-edged sword. So we have another presidency election in 1928. And yes, the Republicans are still shining because there's a lot of money being made and the country is happy with the way things are going. So the Republican candidate is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is going to win in a major landslide, and he will be the guy that ultimately, unfortunately, is going to be the one sitting in the big chair when all the crap falls down in 1929. That ends this chapter. See you next time.